Hey everybody, welcome to Planet Coaster College. Today I'll be talking about the launched coaster Torque, which is a bit of an unusual coaster since it's only based on one ride in real life, which is Full Throttle in Six Flags Magic Mountain. And this coaster is made by Premier Rides, which is a company that specializes in launched coasters. And Full Throttle is also sometimes known as Skyrocket number 3. And this kind of gives us a clue as to what kind of coaster type Torque really is, since Skyrocket refers to the cars and trains that Full Throttle uses. And there is also Skyrocket 2, but that's a cloned coaster type which you see all around the world, which you can't actually make in-game since it's launched out of this station and goes backwards as well. And there's also Skyrocket number 1 in Kennywood, but that uses a slightly different track which is not available in-game. So really the only coaster which you can perfectly recreate with this coaster type is Full Throttle, and that's also what most of its signature elements come from. With that in mind though, I want to say that this is one of the most popular rides in the game by far, and many coasters that are being built are of this type since it's so versatile. So in this video I won't be so much looking into how you can make this coaster realistically, since there's not much to base that on, but instead just look at some of the more signature things that you can do with this coaster and basically how to deal with this thing in game. So with that introduction out of the way, let's get into the building. Alright, so you can find the coaster here as Torque, and when we place the station we want to raise it up a little bit so it's not entirely on the ground, but we don't have to raise it up very high or anything. And we can actually get into the launch straight away from the station. That is what all of the real life versions of the Skyrockets do. And already I do want to say that when it comes to the acceleration rate of the launch, I would put it up to 9 meters per second, because that isn't even that fast and should usually get you a pretty good launch without too long of a stretch to actually get up to speed. If you've got a very small version of this coaster, of course you can always make it lower, but 9 meters per second is already not a very intense kind of launch. So this should usually just about do, and then the target speed just depends on how large you want to make your coaster. I can't really say too much about this exactly, because setting your target speed really just takes some trial and error, just running the coaster a couple of times and seeing what your best speed is. But that said, I think for me 112 kilometers per hour is going to be the magical number if you want to get into the signature elements of this coaster, and I'll explain right now why. Basically this coaster comes with an element that none of the other coasters in game have, which is the top hat loop. And this is the element from Full Throttle, and also what makes it such a special coaster. And it's this huge loop with the track going over it. And when you want to have this element in your coaster, you really have to get it from the loop section here, and you can't make it yourself. I've tried to, but you can't actually intersect the track and perfectly support it, just like it's doing over here. So as you can see, the bottom and the top part of the track are both being used by the coaster here, which is really cool, and the only way in which you can do so is by taking this element. Now there is a very easy way to get to the perfect speed to make that signature element. All you have to do is take the launch section, drag it up to be as long as you can make it, set the acceleration rate to 9 meters per second, and this is always going to be in meters per second, no matter if you've got miles or kilometers set, and that's basically it. Now all you have to do is make sure that your speed is 112 kilometers per hour, or if you can't exactly do it, 113 or something along those lines should work as well, and place 3 of these pieces of track. Now no matter if you've set your target speed to 161, you're always gonna have a little bit over 112 kilometers per hour if you've got 3 maximum length sections of launch section with 9 meters per second acceleration. So now we can get into the signature element, and when we test the coaster right here, we should be getting a perfect speed to make it through this looping right here. There we go. Alright, now to give you an idea of what else you could put in this coaster type, I'm just going to make a very approximate recreation of Full Throttle. It's by heart though, so it's probably not going to be the greatest, but it should give you a pretty decent idea of how this thing works. Before I get into that though, I want to turn up the banking offset, because this coaster does have a hard line, and so we want to make sure that when we start banking our track, we're going to start banking around the car itself, just to make it a little bit more smooth. So that's what we're going to do here. And I want to first get into a quick few curves, and then I'll be back with you. Now we're already at a point here where we're getting up pretty high in the sky, and there's something I want to very quickly note, because you might have noticed that there are two types of track. They both say basic standard track, but they are very different. This one has a sort of simple round spine, which is that backbone of the coaster track right here, and the second one has a very thick spine. Now, I haven't been able to find any sources on this, but usually when coasters have very thick spines like this, it's because they want to use less supports, and this is definitely true in real life of Full Throttle as well, since the lower sections with the regular spine have more supports than the high up sections with less supports, but the thicker spine. So this is what I assume is the reason, and if you really want to have a realistic coaster, I guess you could go for the second standard track, if you want to have a high up section with not so many supports to still make it look like it's actually sound when it comes to the engineering. But then again, I'm not 100% sure on this. It's probably what the reason is, but in any case, in most cases, just having this thicker track on parts with less supports or inversions should make your coaster look a little bit more realistic if you really want to go for it. Now, Full Throttle hits a very interesting and not so common element here, which is a dive drop, which is generally when you're already up quite high, as is the case here, and you're turning around and going down again into a half loop, or a drop in which you're also inverting. And all we're really going to have to do here is make sure that we're starting to get inverting in this curve that we're kind of in here. Something like that should more or less do, and then we're also dropping down at this point. So let's get to exactly 180 degrees, turn on the angle snap here, and just slowly work out a half loop, going back to the ground. And then we'll get into one very interesting part of this coaster. So, our dive drop is looking pretty smooth and good, and I think it's time to get into one of the more confusing parts of this coaster, and definitely one that I've seen quite a few people have some issues with. There's this interesting section called the dual direction linear synchronous motor, and that might seem like the most ridiculous name ever, but basically what it does is it's gonna stop the train at the end of the brakes there. Then it's gonna launch the train backward, going up this element, but not too much, and after it's returning from that element going forwards, it's gonna launch the train again. So basically it's a backwards launch, and then once it comes back to this element, it's gonna be launched forwards again. And again, whatever speed you really want to hit on this thing just kind of depends on what exactly you're looking for. I believe I'm a little bit too low for the coaster to actually hit the standard Full Throttle speed here, but that'll be fine. I'll just turn that up a little bit. But this again just takes a bit of trial and error to get it to actually work, but that's the way it works. So usually when you place these brakes, you want to have somewhat of a high element behind it that your coaster can kind of creep up a little bit as it's going to be launched backwards, to then return and be launched forwards to finish the rest of the track. Okay, so again I have a little bit of a cheat here. I usually just get the track to be as long as you can make it, then put 2 of these launch sections in, and then we'll very quickly finish the rest of the track before I get to the launch section again. So let me quickly make sure that this is all connected. Alright, the curve is looking good. It's already launching the coaster forwards, but I'm afraid that's not gonna make too much of a difference here, since it probably doesn't have the speed to get over that hill. I guess it almost is making it. But basically when we go to the settings here, we can see that there are quite a few things that we can mess with. We've got the reverse launch speed, which is the first thing that we're going to want to look at. This is the speed at which it's going to launch the cars backwards here. Now 76 kilometers in my case is exactly what I'm looking for, since it's just making its way up this element but not quite. Otherwise it might get stuck in the space between this element and the loop at first, so we don't want to quite make it here. So that's pretty good. But then we see that with the forwards boost speed we're going to have a problem, since 112 is not enough to make it over the loop here. So I'll boost it up to about 132, that should make it. Now we also have these 2 halt delay buttons over here, and what these do is they set a sort of window for how long the coaster cars are going to have to wait with launching backwards. Basically there's always this little moment as they reach the end of the launch where they're going to wait for a second, stand still, and then launch backwards. Now you notice that was just about 1 second, and that's because the length that they're going to wait is anywhere within the range that you've set the halt delay to. Now I don't want to keep people waiting too long on the launch, but I do want to kind of have some sort of space between the minimum and the maximum, so that there's always a different like time between when you're actually going to be launched. So you never know when you're going to be launched, which is kind of interesting. So I'll just set this to about 2 seconds. If you really want to torture your people, you could also have it on 30 seconds, but you know, that's not really my thing. So now you're probably thinking, alright, this is a pretty cool coaster so far. We've got that interesting section where it's launching backwards and... Alright, so now you're probably thinking, we've got a pretty cool coaster so far. I can't wait to see what else is going to happen with this. Well, in real life, Full Throttle is going to go over this hill and go into the brakes already on the hill itself and just end the ride right there. But that seems like an incredibly boring thing to do, so I will show you a couple more elements which you could feature on these rides, but keep in mind, realistically, this is already the end of Full Throttle, and it's really only in the interesting top hat and the weird launches that it has that it's a cool ride. It is definitely a very highly rated ride, but it's pretty short as well and it doesn't have too many elements. So I want to show off a few more here. One other element which Skyrocket has at Kennywood that is somewhat worth showing off is the regular top hat. Now the regular top hat is very similar to this, except it's slightly differently shaped, since of course you don't really have to shape it around a loop. So when you're building a regular top hat, you can actually make it almost vertical. So if we take for instance the top hat at Kennywood, it's kind of shaped like this, going pretty vertical over here, and then we're gonna have this moment at the top where it pops over that small hill, probably with a little bit of airtime, but I've never been on that thing, so I can't exactly tell. But this is also an interesting element, and if having a loop underneath your top hat after the launch doesn't really suit your fancy, you can always go for a top hat like this, just a regular old normal top hat, and have that instead of the giant looping contraption. Of course though, we do want to make sure that we're smoothing out this thing quite a bit, and in some spaces, like especially those transitions, I really want to hit the smooth button quite a few times to make sure that the shaping is good and that it doesn't become too jagged on the on-ride. Now what you can also do with these top hats is to install some trim brakes on the top when it's going very slowly over there, to kind of hold it down as it's going down, just like a dive coaster, to make it a little bit more scary perhaps. By the way, I've set these to a very high deceleration rate because you really want to catch the coaster, and to a very low target speed because it's already going down. So if you really want to make sure you can hold down the coaster with trim brakes, you really have to set the target speed very low and the deceleration very high. Now this right now is pretty awesome. We are losing quite a bit of speed with that though, but I do want to say I'm just going to make this layout pretty ridiculous at this point and just show off some of the stuff that you can do with these coasters, because again, I definitely want to stress that if anything, this Planet Coaster College should not be seen as a one-on-one kind of tutorial on how to build one of these, simply because they are super versatile and there are only a few of them in real life, but more or less focusing on the things that you can do with these. So actually getting the launch speeds right and working with some of the elements that we have. Now one other element that you could add to one of these rides, which you can find in the non-inverted section, is the non-inverting loop. And I just wanted to put this here because I think it's a very fun element. I normally don't really pay attention too much to the in-game inversions, because even though they are very often better than what you can do yourself, and this is in no means trying to blast everyone here by saying that nobody can make good inversions, but the in-game inversions are actually smoother than what is often possible if you make them by hand. So that's why I would recommend making this kind of inversion by placing the in-game one. I do want to make that a bit smaller though. But I usually just want to address inversions and elements that you have to make yourself that the coaster doesn't give you. So that's why I normally do that. That speed, by the way, could be a little bit faster. But yeah, one of these elements is really interesting because they're quite common on the, well, they're on every single Skyrocket too. So they could very well be a very interesting kind of element for these coasters as well. So we've got some interesting stuff. Now, these coasters can have pretty much any element, but there's one element which I want to talk about because it's a very rare element and it's one that the game doesn't really give you. It's the cutback. There's a cutback on the original Skyrocket, and this is a super rare element. It's kind of like a corkscrew, but instead of the second part of the corkscrew twisting again in the same direction, you go in the opposite direction. So it's kind of like a ridiculously overbanked curve, and that's also the way that you make these things. You're pretty much going inverted, but once you go upside down, you start reverting into the same direction again. So generally, to make this kind of cutback, we just want to start going up, while we're also gonna start banking a little bit. And actually in this case, since I'm going to make it pretty large, I want to make the track section pretty large as well. About 3 track sections should work per half part of the cutback. So I'm going to put another section over here, make sure that we're banking just a little bit more. I might actually make this a tiny bit smaller. It's gonna be pretty steep, but that is what we're looking for here. And we want to make sure that we are at about 90 degrees curve at the top. So let's see, I think that'll be good. Yeah, looks like that'll be good. So I'm going to start banking, or stop the banking for a little bit there, and go upside down. And I think after that we can already start heading back again and pretty much do the same thing, but in a mirrored version. I want to really try to make this as symmetrical as I can, so it's usually going to take a little bit of trial and error and also a bit of smoothing button to make sure that both sides of the cutback are actually good. But I think this will be, yeah, this should be decent. This can be a little bit less steep, and then we can end the curve like that. And then the smoothing tool should take care of the rest, because it's looking very awkwardly shaped right now, but that shouldn't be too much of an issue. I do want to make sure though that the brake run is very slightly angled, so I'm just gonna have a very slight angle to this end as well, and that should be it. So let's grab the smooth button. Now when it comes to the smoothing, this again just takes a bit of trial and error to get stuff right, but I generally just sort of alternate between smoothing 2 track sections, smoothing a selection, and smoothing the entire thing. Usually what I do is I want to make sure that both parts of the inversions are generally smooth, and I usually do that by selecting one half of the inversion, smoothing it, but I also want to make sure that some transitions are a little bit extra smooth. So this is still looking a little bit weird. I want to smooth that out a bit, and I'll do the same on the other side. And as a final touch, to make sure that it's one smooth, fluent motion, I want to smooth out the entire inversion, and I think that should be generally good. Now this is a grotesquely oversized cutback though. That's something I would like to mention. Most of them would be, well, about half this size, perhaps even smaller, but this is really the basic idea of the inversion. After that, all I've done to finish the ride is install some brake runs at the end. We've got some regular brakes over here, and a few block brakes over here, just to make sure that we can run 2 trains on this thing. And that is all we've done to finish this layout. Now I want to say, this is definitely a crazy, ridiculous layout, and I would not recommend building something like this. This is just to give you an idea of what kind of inversions and elements you can build in these kinds of coasters. That aside, there are no real guidelines as to how to build these things, because again, there are barely any of them in real life, so I would just say, take this stuff and try to be as creative as you can with it, and of course have fun while you're building these things. And if you really wanted to have something realistic, or have an approximate recreation of Full Throttle, you could have just ended the ride right here. Also, what I want to very quickly note is these top hats should definitely be placed at the beginning of a ride, if anything. So they'd be placed after the launch, where you'd be launched going into the top hats and then waiting for the first drop. That's how I would say it should generally work. They shouldn't be in the middle of the layout like this. This is just to show you how one of these things can look. Anyway, that's enough talk about the coaster. Let's get into it. Alright, so we're starting off from the station straight into the launch and into the enormous looping, which is actually the second biggest looping in the world, if I'm not mistaken, which does have quite a bit of hang time, but it does that in real life as well, and it's quite nice to have it. I haven't really felt it myself, but anyway, we're getting into these curves, which are pretty smooth and long winding, into another section with quite a bit of hang time, and into the pretty rough brakes of the second launch. There isn't really anything that you can do about these brakes, only the launch speeds you can actually adjust. So there isn't too much that you can do about the fact that these brakes do break the coaster down in a pretty rough manner. But overall, the launch speeds are really the most important thing here, and we're getting launched at the top hat at quite a pretty good speed. And over the top hat with that little bit of airtime, hopefully, I'm not sure. and into the second top hat, which is really just there to kind of show you what you can do with these things, but it's still a pretty fun element. Down into that almost vertical drop, and over the non-inverting loop, which is one of those pretty good in-game elements, and definitely something you want to get in-game rather than perhaps making it yourself, unless you really want to get the shaping that you need. And finally the cutback. And now we're in the brakes, which are also quite rough, I would say. At the end you can definitely extend them and have it break down a little bit slower, but overall I am pretty content with this. Even though it's a pretty terrible layout, this is pretty much a lot of the elements that you can put in these coasters and the way that much of these elements work. Anyway, that's all I have in store for today. If you guys are still looking for more inspiration, I greatly recommend checking out the Full Throttle POV and checking out the Skyrocket POV as well. Both very interesting coasters to look at, and most of all, just have fun building these coasters because they're really fun to build, super versatile, and can do lots of crazy things. Thank you guys for watching, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you guys next time.